And as the most advanced EU candidate country, Montenegro remains steadfast in implementing structural reforms and fully aligned with the European Union's common foreign and security policy. We are convinced that the EU integration is a catalyst for lasting progress, stability, and ultimately security of the European continent. And in this process, Montenegro is not only a beneficiary, but also a contributor, demonstrating that enlargement strengthens the European Union as much as it strengthens the candidate countries. Your Excellencies, to strengthen multilateralism, we also must confront its weaknesses. The Security Council is increasingly paralyzed and unable to fulfill its mandate as the primary guardian of peace and security. The latest example is the war in Ukraine, which has brought unimaginable suffering to the people of Ukraine. And Montenegro welcomes recent diplomatic efforts of the international community led by the United States aimed at achieving a just and lasting peace. And we sincerely hope that these efforts will succeed. At the same time, Montenegro is deeply concerned about the unfolding humanitarian suffering of the Palestinian people in Gaza. And we call for an immediate ceasefire. Montenegro also strongly condemned the horrific terrorist attack by Hamas on October the 7th, 2023, and calls for unconditional release of all hostages. Montenegro has consistently supported a peaceful resolution of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict based on the two-state solution in full accordance with international law and relevant United Nations resolutions. And this is why we also endorsed the New York Declaration on the peaceful settlement of the question of Palestine and the implementation of the two-state solution. Dear colleagues, dear delegates, Montenegro fully supports the implementation of the UN Pact for the Future as well as the Seville Compromise, a renewed global commitment for financing sustainable development as important steps in strengthening our collective capacity to respond to global challenges. And we also believe that the upcoming second World Summit for Social Development must move decisively beyond reflection and analysis and deliver concrete, tangible solutions that will improve lives of people across the globe. Ladies and gentlemen, back in 1991, Montenegro proudly became the world's first ecological state, a milestone that proclaimed our commitment to the highest principles of environmental protection, the preservation of nature, and the pursuit of sustainable development. UN Agenda 2030 remains our guiding light for sustainable development, and Montenegro takes pride in being among the first countries in the world to integrate all the SDGs into its national framework almost a decade ago. A further important step in advancing the implementation of the 2030 Agenda was the creation of the SDG Acceleration Fund, a powerful mechanism for financing SDG goals. Ladies and gentlemen, for Montenegro, the priority is clear, which is to create conditions that will enable our young people to build their future at home, offering them equal opportunities to thrive. And by insisting on the value of knowledge and ensuring equal access to education, we strive to reduce inequalities and empower our citizens to reach their full potential. Ladies and gentlemen, climate change must be tackled globally and urgently. And it is no longer just warnings from the scientists. It is floods that swallow villages and cities, fires that destroy forests, fields, and homes, and delaying a more decisive action on the international scale means gambling with the lives of those who live today, but also of the future generations. Dear colleagues, rapid technological change, and particularly the rise of the artificial intelligence, must be harnessed in a safe, responsible, and inclusive manner. Technology should be an evolutionary gift to humanity, developed, founded, and guided with social responsibility, serving the greater good. Ladies and gentlemen, globally, human rights and fundamental freedoms continue to face serious challenges. And while significant progress has been achieved in advancing women's rights since the adoption of the Beijing Declaration, much remains to be done. In this regard, Montenegro is fully committed to gender equality. We have harmonized national policies with the best international standards, strengthened our institutions dedicated to the protection of women's rights, and promoted women's leadership in all spheres of our society. Your Excellencies, as we celebrate today 80 years of shared achievements, our collective task is to reform the United Nations and prepare it for the challenges and opportunities of the future. Criticism of the UN reflects not just on the organization itself, but on all of us as member states. For it is we who have created it. Not be seen as a mere bureaucratic exercise, but embraced as a commitment, a solemn commitment that the United Nations of tomorrow will be more agile and more efficient. And at the heart of these efforts must remain the UN's three key pillars: peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights, as the bedrock of all United Nations action. To conclude, dear friends, Montenegro is firm in its conviction that the United Nations must remain the cornerstone of peace, international law must prevail over force, and the rule-based order must be further strengthened. For without these principles, there can be no trust among nations, no true security, and no hope for a just and lasting peace in the world. And let me, at the end, quote the most famous writer from our part of the world and the Nobel Prize laureate, Ivo Andrić, who wrote in his masterpiece, The Bridge on the River Drina, of everything that man erects and builds in his urge for living, nothing is, in my eyes, better and more valuable than bridges. They are more important than houses, more sacred than temples, for they belong to all and are equal for everyone. Dear colleagues, this timeless truth reminds us that bridges are not only structures of stone, but structures of peace. It is a dialogue that builds bridges, and it is only through bridges that nations can walk towards peace. So our task is not to be passive heirs of history, but active builders of a better legacy. So let the next 8 years of the United Nations be not years of hesitation, but of courage and solidarity. So guided by these values, Montenegro will continue to build bridges, strengthen dialogue, and work tirelessly towards a future of stability, future of progress, and future of common success, fully aligned with the very spirit and mission of the United Nations. Thank you very much for your attention.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank the President of Montenegro. In accordance with Resolution 80/1 of 19 September 2025, I give the floor to the distinguished observer of the Observer State of Palestine to introduce an address by the Head of State.
In the name of God, the Merciful, the Compassionate, Her Excellency Annalena Baerbock, President of the General Assembly, His Excellency Antonio Guterres, Secretary General of the United Nations, Your Excellencies, Highnesses, and Heads of Delegations, may the mercy and blessings of God be upon you. I speak to you today after almost 2 years in which our Palestinian people in the Gaza Strip have been facing a war of genocide, destruction, starvation, and displacement waged by the Israeli occupation forces, in which they killed and injured more than 220,000 Palestinians, the majority of whom are unarmed children, women, and the elderly. A war in which they displaced hundreds of thousands and prevented the entry of food and medical supplies and caused the starvation of 2 million Palestinians. They imposed a stifling siege on an entire people and destroyed more than 80% of homes, schools, hospitals, churches, mosques, facilities, and infrastructure. What Israel is carrying out is not merely an aggression. It is a war crime and a crime against humanity that is both documented and monitored, and it will be recorded in history books and the pages of international conscience as one of the most horrific chapters of humanitarian tragedy in the 20th and 21st centuries. In the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, the capital of the State of Palestine, the extremist Israeli government continues to implement its settlement policies through illegal settlement expansion and developing projects for annexing settlements. The latest was the construction plan for E1, which would divide the West Bank into 2 parts and would isolate occupied Jerusalem from its surroundings and would undermine the option of the two-state solution in a blatant violation of international law and relevant Security Council resolutions, specifically Resolution 2334. Furthermore, the Israeli Prime Minister announced a plan for what he calls Greater Israel, which we reject and completely deplore, and which involves expanding into sovereign Arab states. In addition to the brutal attack against the sisterly state of Qatar, which we condemn and see as an escalation that is grave and a blatant violation of international law, which requires a decisive intervention and deterring procedures and measures for such expansionary plans. With official support and through increasing facilities, the terrorism of settlers increases. They burn homes and fields. They uproot trees and attack villages and attack unarmed Palestinian civilians. In fact, they kill them in broad daylight under the protection of the Israeli occupation army. Furthermore, the Islamic and Christian religious sites in Jerusalem, Hebron, and Gaza Strip have not been spared the attacks which have damaged the mosques, churches, and cemeteries in a blatant violation of the historic status quo and in a clear violation of the provisions of the international law. Despite all what our people have suffered, we reject what Hamas carried out on the 7th of October. These actions that targeted Israeli civilians and took them hostages, because these actions do not represent the Palestinian people, nor do they represent their just struggle for freedom and independence. We have affirmed, and we will continue to affirm, that the Gaza Strip is an integral part of the state of Palestine, and that we are ready to bear full responsibility for governance and security there. Hamas will not have a role to play in governance. Hamas and other factions will have to hand over their weapons to the Palestinian National Authority as part of a process to build the institutions of a one state, one law, and one legal security forces. We reiterate that we do not want an armed state. Ladies and gentlemen, our wounds are deep and our calamity is great. 7 million Palestinians are still living the tragedies of the Nakba and displacement since 1948. Our people in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, and in the Gaza Strip, are still living the tragedies of the Israeli aggression and occupation for decades. Years that our people have spent under occupation, killing, arrests, and settlement, and the theft of money, property, and lands. And this still continues without any deterrent or accountability. Years of oppression, deprivation, and the protection for the occupier, and enabling the occupier instead of protecting the people under the occupation, and more violations of the rights of our Palestinian people to self-determination, to freedom, dignity, independence, and sovereignty on the land of the occupied state, on the land of the state of Palestine occupied since 1967, including East Jerusalem. More than 1,000 resolutions at the United Nations, not one of them was implemented. There have been many efforts, many international initiatives, without reaching an end to this tragic situation that the Palestinian people are living under the yoke of occupation. In 1993, we signed the Oslo Accords, and we adhered to all its items, and we recognized the state of Israel. Israel, at the time, recognized the Palestine Liberation Organization as the sole legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. Based on that, we restructured our institutions, and we amended our national charter, and we rejected violence and terrorism, and we adopted a culture of peace. We made all our efforts to build the institutions of a modern Palestinian state that lives side by side in peace and security with Israel. But Israel did not adhere to the signed agreements and has worked systematically on undermining them. Ladies and gentlemen, just 3 days ago, we met at a high-level international conference in New York under the joint chairmanship of France and the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, with wide-scale international presence and united positions that expressed a genuine international will to put an end to this historic conflict by recognizing the state of Palestine, ending the occupation, and returning hope to both the Palestinian and Israeli people. And here I would like to, on behalf of the Palestinian people, to express our gratitude and appreciation to all the states that recently recognized the state of Palestine and those that intend to recognize the state of Palestine soon. We urge all the states that have not done so yet to recognize the state of Palestine. We call on supporting Palestine obtaining full membership in the United Nations. It should be noted that we have already recognized Israel's right to exist in 1988 and in 1993, and we still recognize this right. In this regard, we would like to thank France, the UK, Canada, Australia, Belgium, Portugal, Luxembourg, Malta, Monaco, San Marino, Andorra, and Denmark for their recognition of the state of Palestine. We would like to thank all 149 states which had previously recognized the state of Palestine. Our people will not forget this noble position. We would also like to commend the role of the chairmanship of this conference, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and France, and also the United Kingdom. We would also like to thank all the states that headed the various working groups and those which participated and continue to participate in the International Alliance for Peace. We would also like to thank the states that are supporting our efforts to stop the genocide, end the occupation, and achieve peace. We highly appreciate all the peoples and organizations around the world who protested in support of the rights of the Palestinian people to freedom and independence and to stop the war, destruction, and starvation. We reject confusing the solidarity with the Palestinian cause and the issue of anti-Semitism, which is something that we reject based on our values and principles. Within the framework of welcoming the outcomes of the International Conference for Peace, we reiterate today before the General Assembly the following points. First, the need for an immediate and permanent end to the war in Gaza. Second, the entry without conditions of humanitarian aid through United Nations organizations, including the UNRWA, and to stop using starvation as a weapon. And here we would like to thank the brotherly and friendly states and organizations that have been sending aids. Third, the release of all hostages and prisoners on both sides. Fourth, the complete withdrawal of the occupation from the Gaza Strip and the rejection of the plans for displacement and putting an end to settlement, the terrorism of settlers, and the theft of Palestinian lands and property under the headline of annexation, and stopping the aggression against the status quo in holy sites. These are all unilateral actions that undermine the two-state solution in Gaza, the West Bank, and Jerusalem. Fifth, the state of Palestine should take their full responsibility starting with the Administrative Committee for the Gaza Strip, which is chaired by a minister in the Palestinian government to manage the affairs of the Gaza Strip for a temporary period, and then to connect that with the West Bank, all through Arab and international support, and with Arab and international presence to protect civilians in Gaza and support the Palestinian forces under the umbrella of the United Nations, rather than being a replacement. Sixth, to guarantee that the residents of the Gaza Strip remain on their lands without displacement, and to implement a recovery and reconstruction plan in both the Gaza Strip and the West Bank. Seventh, releasing the Palestinian tax money that is being held by the State of Israel unjustly, and lifting the economic siege and the barriers from the Palestinian cities, villages, and refugee camps. Eighth, supporting our national efforts towards reform and conducting presidential and parliamentary elections within a year after the end of the war. The practical procedures has begun. A committee has been assigned to draft a temporary constitution, and it will end its work within 3 months, so that we move from authority to state. We want a modern and democratic state that abides by international law, the rule of law, and multilateralism, and the peaceful transition of power. And we are extremely keen to empower women and the youth. Ninth, we declare that we are ready to work with US President Donald Trump and with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and France, the United Nations, and all partners to implement the peace plan that was approved in the conference that was held on the 22nd of September, in a way that would lead towards a just peace and regional cooperation. Ladies and gentlemen, today we say clearly, peace cannot be achieved if justice is not achieved, and there can be no justice if Palestine is not freed. We want to live in freedom, security, and peace like all other people on earth, in an independent, sovereign state on the borders of 1967, with East Jerusalem as our capital, in security and peace with our neighbors. We want a modern civilian state that is free of violence, weapons, and extremism, one that respects law, human rights, and invests in people, development, technology, and education, not in wars and conflict. The time has come for the international community to do right by the Palestinian people, so that they may obtain their legitimate rights to be rid of the occupation and to not remain a hostage to the temperament of Israeli politics, which denies our rights and continue in their injustice, oppression, and aggression. We are continuing to move forward, and we will continue our peaceful, legal, and diplomatic fight to obtain our rights. In conclusion, we say to our sons and daughters in the homeland, in the exile, and in the diaspora, no matter how much our wounds bleed, and no matter how long the suffering lasts, it will not break our will to live and survive. The dawn of freedom will emerge, and the flag of Palestine will fly high in our skies, as a symbol of dignity, steadfastness, and being free from the yoke of occupation. Palestine is ours. Jerusalem is the jewel of our heart and our eternal capital. We will not leave our homeland. We will not leave our lands. Our people will remain rooted like the olive trees, firm as the rocks. We will rise from under the rubble to rebuild and to send from our blessed and holy land the messages of hope and the sound of truth and right, and build the bridges of just peace for the people of our region and the entire world. May the peace and mercy and blessings of God be upon you.
On behalf of the Assembly, I wish to thank His Excellency Mahmoud Abbas, President of the State of Palestine. The Assembly will hear an address now by His Excellency Rashad Mohammed Al-Alimi, President of the Presidential Leadership Council of the Republic of Yemen. I request protocol to escort His Excellency and invite him to address the Assembly.
In the name of God, most gracious, most merciful. My statement today will be entitled, For Yemen, for the World. Your Majesties, Your Excellencies, Your Highnesses, Madam President of the General Assembly of the United Nations, Mr. Secretary General, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished delegates. I would first like to offer Madam Annalena Baerbock and her friendly country, the Federal Republic of Germany, I'd like to offer them our sincere congratulations on her election as President of the United Nations General Assembly. I wish her success in leading this session, which we attach great importance to as under the slogan, Better Together for Peace, Development and Human Rights. I would also like to commend the efforts of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Antonio Guterres. We look forward to working with these two leaders of the United Nations to champion peace and human rights in Yemen, and to offer protection to the relief staff that have been kidnapped by the terrorist Houthi militias that are backed by the Iranian regime. I also take this opportunity to offer our sincere congratulations to our great Yemeni people who tonight are celebrating the anniversary of the overthrow of the racist Imamate regime 63 years ago, and the birth of the republic that is based on the principles of liberty, justice, and abolishing differences and class discrimination, and encouraging the participation of women and guaranteeing rights and liberties. Ladies and gentlemen, within this organization, which was built in the aftermath of a horrific war, humanity 8 decades ago pledged that no people would be left alone to face dictatorship or chaos or famine without the backing of the international community. You pledged, and we pledged along, that this organization will safeguard human dignity and the rights of peoples to live in dignity, security, development, and peace. And today, after all these years have passed, we pose to you the same fateful question from the Yemeni people, whether these values and principles continue to exist or not, or else what would it mean for our country to be left hostage to the Iranian regime's expansionist schemes and its militias that use hunger as a weapon, religion as a tool, and maritime passages as a means of blackmail? What does it mean for this country with an ancient history to become one of the most dangerous hotspots of terrorism, cross-border terrorism in the world? Therefore, We are here today not simply to speak of the epic confrontation of the Yemeni people against the most violent and arrogant of terrorist organizations at all. Rather, we are here to build on what was achieved and to call on the world once again to take action and not simply to take note, and to achieve the salvation that we have promised our people, not simply a repetition of statements of the past. Ladies and gentlemen, Yemen today is not simply a domestic crisis. Rather, it is a test of the credibility of the international organization. After a decade has passed to the coup that was orchestrated by the Houthi militias supported by the Iranian regime against the national consensus, our people are living one of the gravest humanitarian crises, facing security threats that transcend our borders and spread to the region and the entire world. The Houthi militias are no longer a rebel group in a remote area in the country. Rather, the Houthi militias are an international terrorist organization armed to the teeth with an advanced Iranian arsenal, including ballistic missiles and drones and booby-trapped boats and sea mines and fissile projectiles and other qualitative weapons that are internationally banned. In addition, this outlaw group supports networks that smuggle drugs and utilize new technologies to disrupt communications and guidance systems in an attempt to transform Yemen into a laboratory to experiment with the weapons of its supporters. These are not simply tools of war. Rather, this is a scheme to redraw the map of Iranian influence in the region. And those who are lenient with this group today must imagine how tomorrow will be when the Red Sea and maritime passengers fall prey permanently to this terrorism. Therefore, ladies and gentlemen, the past years have proven that the policy of conflict management, by offering more incentives, has only brought more disaster and destruction. Moreover, the policy of containment has given the Houthi militias the time and the resources to further expand its arsenal. The United Nations was unable to protect its own staff who were kidnapped in Sana'a, unable to protect the oil installations and the commercial ships. It has become clear that the peace we seek cannot be asked for, but must be imposed by force. Ladies and gentlemen, it has become incumbent upon the world today to reconsider its position on the Yemeni situation. On the one side, there is a widespread national front that believes in international legitimacy and adopts the values of partnership and democracy and maintains local diversity and popular participation and works on building the institutions of a state. This is the front that I represent today, myself and my brothers, the members of the Presidential Council and the government, which is a member of the United Nations and represents all Yemenis, men and women alike. In return, we have an exclusionary, sectarian, fascist organization that does not believe in the principles of international legitimacy and which conducts cross-border terrorism and adopts an authoritarian theocracy that is opposed to human rights, which is embodied by the Houthis and their supporters. Unfortunately, the disregard by many of the essence of the Yemeni crisis has encouraged the Houthi militias to go further in threatening peace regionally and internationally and targeting energy sources and maritime passages and even kidnapping and abusing United Nations staff. Ladies and gentlemen, I have spoken to you from this podium in the past. And at the time, I asserted that the government of the Republic of Yemen is always ready to embrace a comprehensive peace, even if that includes making painful concessions, as long as they come in the interest of the Yemeni people. However, and after our efforts to maintain peace have failed, it has become necessary to move collectively and firmly to impose peace. Therefore, I call on you today to form an effective international coalition to restore security and stability to Yemen, a coalition that would rebuild the institutions of the state and would liberate the country from the clutches of the militias and all forms of terrorist groups. Ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations General Assembly, in its 80th session, seems to be in dire need to prove to its members that international law is not simply a myth and that the rules-based international order is not simply a selective call. Yemen and Gaza, in this context, are the moral testing ground of this important organization. They are the place where we can definitely confirm that the might of right is still able to confront the right of might. And here, the Palestinian cause lies in the heart of this issue as a wound that continues to bleed, and the central cause of the Arab people, which is now also witnessing an important transformation to the overwhelming recognition of an independent state. And here we would like to express our sincere gratitude to our brothers and sisters in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia for their efforts, along with their French partners, to achieve these unprecedented political gains. We'd also like to confirm here our full support for the Palestinian Authority and the two-state solution in accordance with international legitimacy resolutions and the Arab Peace Initiative. And we call upon the rest of the member states to recognize Palestine and to support the rights of its people and their dignity. And at the same time, we reiterate our rejection of the use by outlaw militias of this just cause that has, as a trading card, which has only brought Palestine more isolation and destruction. Your Majesties, Excellencies, and Highnesses, in the midst of this suffering of the Yemeni people that has lasted for 11 years, our brethren have not left us alone, namely the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, who have not only worked to protect the Yemeni state from collapse, but for the entire region from falling into the clutches of the Iranian scheme. They have presented a practical model of strategic partnership based on development. The world must adopt this model and not simply watch it. At the end of last week, our brothers in the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia once again announced additional economic aid to the country's budget and basic services at a time when the Yemeni government is facing extreme financial bottlenecks. And we hope that the international community would join this effort so that we could keep millions of Yemenis alive. Mr. President, ladies and gentlemen, the title of my statement today was For Yemen, for the World. We are not calling upon you today to simply work for Yemen, but for the entire world. Yemen must not be left to fall prey for blackmail and terrorism, because this would mean opening the door to more victims, and this would deliver a blow to the credibility of this organization and its principles. What we ask from you are not new statements, but international action.
contract. Living in one of the most climate vulnerable regions in the world, the Mediterranean, Macedonian citizens are already experiencing the consequences of the climate crisis, such as extreme weather conditions. That is why we supported the implementation of the Paris Agreement at COP29 in Baku. We supported the Seville commitment on financing for development and integrated the Sustainable Development Goals in our National Development Strategy 2024-2044. At the third UN Ocean Conference in Nice, we committed to strong international